All right, we are good.
Okay.
Should I ask the first question?
Sure.
Go ahead. Okay, so, what was the most common satirical strategy that you found in Huckfin? Like, when we were doing our annotations, what was the easiest for you guys to find?
I found a lot of humor throughout the book, like the entire spoon scene. Like I found that hilarious, and there was the entire Duke and the King doing all these crazy things, and that Shakespeare, the entire making fun of Shakespeare and having that entire just weird ode, and like the ode to Stephen Dowling Bots decided on page 102 and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on page 136, I think is the speech you're talking about. And I didn't know this, but I looked it up, and like this speech is completely made up. Like, I was correctly.
It was. I think that the beginning of it, like a large portion of it, was from Macbeth. I think, because like wake Duncan with thy knocking.
Mm-hmm. I think like the first 5 words, to be or not to be, was right, and then everything else was just wrong.
Yeah.
I was like reading it, and I haven't read Hamlet or Macbeth. I was like, this is not right. So
I did an extensive analysis on this entire like Macbeth in my sophomore year, and the only 2 lines which I could actually recognize from it was "to be or not to be," "murders the innocent sleet," and "wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst." So there's only like 3 lines that are actually from Shakespeare, and everything else is just a jumbled up mess.
Well, it was kind of entertaining and a little interesting to me that Twain had Huck Finn still think it was incredible and so well performed, like it was made for this role. And so I thought that was pretty funny that he kind of poked fun at that.
Yeah, and that was like the entire satire of it all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Caroline's question, like even right at the beginning, I feel like, especially compared to the other satires, like we were practicing and reading and stuff, like I feel like Twain's is kind of easy to point out. Like at the beginning on page 3, when, let's see, Miss Watson was talking to Huck about trying to be like a better person religious wise and like how he can achieve his goal of like getting to heaven or whatever. And then Huck responds after she says that Tom Sawyer is gonna go to hell and he would too if he continued to act like them like him, and he said, "I was glad about that because I wanted him and me to be together." I just thought like the whole satire of like his religious aspects of everything was actually like hilarious. So
oh yeah.
I also found that like another rhetorical device that Twain used a lot was irony too. Like towards the end when Jim was portrayed as like a heroic figure, that was kind of ironic because at the time African Americans were treated so poorly and they were said to have like a lot of bad qualities. But at the end there, Jim really portrayed some good qualities like selflessness and loyalty. So that was like kind of ironic, but it showed that a lot of people's like common beliefs weren't maybe true. So he's kind of like satirizing that too.
Yeah, I was actually really interested in Huck's view of Jim as it progressed, and especially at the end, because when he said, "Go get the doctor, I'll stay with Tom," after he got shot and they were on the run, on 275, Huck, in reference to Jim, said, "I knowed he was white inside." So I found it kind of ironic that the way he described Jim being selfless was to call him white instead of adjusting his opinion of African Americans.
You know, I think that's totally true. It is kind of funny. I read that. I was like, wait, what? But I think that kind of has to do with like maybe like just the details of like revealing how he's actually satirizing this stuff by verbalizing it. And if you don't verbalize it, maybe it's too subtle to grab. But when you do verbalize it, it's like, oh my gosh, there's something wrong here. So I think that, yeah, he's definitely use of irony and just details. Like when he reveals Huck's train of thought, then he kind of reveals lots of other, kind of less visible, maybe prejudices, and definitely brings them into full focus.
Yeah, I also found that he used a lot of symbolism, especially with like the river and the raft, because on page 85, like it literally clearly says what the symbol is supposed to be. In the end of the first paragraph, it says, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States. So obviously the river is supposed to represent the Free States, and he's not disguising that at all. And I found a lot of symbolism, and it's kind of ironic the fact that Huck is writing from this, well, he is a little boy, from his point of view, and he doesn't realize how deep his thoughts really are.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a lot of symbolism used throughout the story too, because I definitely saw how like the river was a symbol, and then also like on page 218 when Huck comes to like the Phelps farm, that was kind of symbolic of Huck's return to civilization, because it's not that much different than St. Petersburg, so the story kind of like starts and ends in civilization. So even though he's like traveled for so long, he like starts and ends at the same place, but he changes like dramatically between those 2 points. So it's kind of like showing that like you can never really get away from society, but you can still like grow and change as an individual. So.
And I think that was kind of the point of the satire there, was showing them the change that could happen and should have happened earlier.
Okay, so I'd like to propose another question. In the book, we never find out the kings and the dukes' true identities, and we only know them as their false names. Why do you think Twain decided to do that?
I was thinking, because actually I never noticed that before, that they never really implicitly state, the names. Like at most you'll call him Bilgewater, which I thought was kind of funny, instead of Bridgewater. But I was thinking that that's obviously satirizing, kings and dukes and, just assuming power and obviously, like, obvious frauds. And I think he's also in a way satirizing the way that society allows that to keep happening. Because, like, even though maybe frauds aren't that new or, that revolutionary, but Huck and Jim kind of, humor him by, pretending, and they say, like, Your Majesty and stuff. I mean, on page 124, he said, so we set in, like we done before with the Duke, and tried to comfort him. But it weren't no use, nothing but to be dead and done with it all. Could do him any good, though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people treated him according to his rights and got down on one knee to speak to him and always called him Your Majesty and waited on him first at meals and didn't sit down in his presence till he asked them. So Jim and me set to majestying him. And I was just wondering why they would do that. Maybe you could carry that on, like Huck is a child, and maybe Jim had some other reason to do that, but I was just thought that was interesting. Maybe he's satirizing that too.
I think that why they did that was because Huck never found like a point in going otherwise. He explicitly states on page 125, if I never learned nothing else out of Pap, I learned that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way. And so Huck is just, he did everything that Pop wanted. He did everything that the king and the duke wanted. And I really think that's a big part of this satire of the king and the duke's characters.
Yeah, I agree with you and Angelina, because what Angelina was saying about how it kind of plays into the satire of the fact that people weren't even realizing these obvious frauds. So I think those are the people that Twain is trying to poke fun at, because on page 209, this is an example, it says, first, they done a lecture on temperance, but they didn't make enough for them both to get drunk on. So, I mean, that is like an extreme example of like, these men are like totally ironic, I guess. They're not practicing what they're preaching. Like, they're, in this example, preaching about, oh, you should restrain from using alcohol. That's like temperance, but then they're trying to get drunk from the money. So, I mean, by calling them the king and the duke throughout the whole story, it's kind of mocking their roles and how people didn't realize that.
I think he's.
Yeah, I definitely
Oh, go ahead.
agree with that. Sorry, Abby. I definitely agree with that. That Twain is kind of like satirizing people's like gullibility and like ignorance, kind of. Because, like you said, people didn't really realize that like the king and the duke were so like hypocritical and not really like practicing what they were preaching. And just like another example of Twain kind of like showing how gullible and ignorant people are in chapter 11 when Huck was like disguising himself as a girl to like trick adults into like thinking that he was a girl, which it like seems pretty obvious. And the woman that he was talking to did like realize, well, like we're completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually like a guy.
Yeah, I was gonna add that I think he's also with the king and the duke, especially with their pronounced roles as like being the king and the duke. I think Twain is almost satirizing the fact that society thinks that if you have like some sort of high position, whether even if it's in government or if it's in like some sort of royalty position, like you're automatically perfect and that people just obey you because you have the name. So I think he's kind of satirizing the fact that, like Caroline said, like the gullibility of like society.
So I have another like question to propose. So do you think that incorporating Tom Sawyer into the story was done simply to lighten up the mood? And what do you think the story would be like if Tom Sawyer was not included in it?
I think Tom Sawyer is like important to be in the story because he does come back at the end, and I think you guys already mentioned that, you know, it starts in civilization, ends in civilization, and there's definitely symmetry there where it begins with Tom Sawyer's heists, which are they're exaggerated, like you have to murder someone to stay in this club, and it also ends with Tom Sawyer with all his, you know, decorum and stuff. So actually, in another satire analysis I did when I was in humanities or something, we read Candide, and all the central players came back at the end. And I was wondering if that's a hallmark of satire. And I do think that maybe Tom Sawyer does represent something bigger than himself. Maybe, like you guys said, civilization, like the very idea of it, since Tom Sawyer is different than Huck in many ways. After I read the book, I was reading online, like, what's the difference between the two books, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Adventures of Tom Sawyer? And I think there was like something online that said, well, the two characters are supposed to be very different. Huck is poor with an alcoholic, abusive father, whereas Tom Sawyer, even though he lives in a very like traditional mindset, he has to, you know, be mischievous, the traditional classical, you know, heroic way. He actually grew up very well off. So those two are at immediate contrasts there.
I feel like Huck is more of a representation of everything that how Huck can never escape his past life. He got caught up with drunks again, the way where his pap was drunk and now the king and the duke were drunk, and then later on he got caught up with his old life again, even going so far as to say, I've been there before, and he went back to the same type of people who wanted to civilize him. And I just feel that his return is more of a symbolism of how he can never escape his old life.
I also think that Tom Sawyer might be a symbol for like the mischievous nature of a boy, because he is like totally the opposite of his Aunt Sally. Like, they're complete foils. Like, the goal of Aunt Sally is to civilize Huck, Huck, like you were saying. And then when Tom Sawyer comes back into the book at the end on page 214, Huck is like thinking through his decisions, like, do I want to go this like naughty route, he guesses, and it says, I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again. And so this wickedness obviously isn't bad because he's helping free slaves. But as soon as Tom Sawyer comes into the picture, Huck is thinking that it's wicked and his conscience is kind of like confused. So I feel like Tom Sawyer represents that mischievous side of Huck, and that comes out when he's around Tom Sawyer.
Well, I think too, Huck or Tom makes he's good for the audience because he kind of gets us frustrated about getting Jim out, because they easily could have gotten him out and we didn't know at the time he was already free. But you're sitting there and you're reading it and you're going, he could be out by now. Why isn't Tom just letting it happen? And so I think that helps, because what I've noticed throughout this satire unit is the emotions you're meant to feel are very clear. And so in this part, you're meant to be frustrated with it, because I think Twain was frustrated with it too, because I know he was anti-slavery. So he was probably trying to convey the sort of frustration that he felt with it as well.
And I agree with Alisha and going alongside of the frustration that everybody was feeling. I feel that that frustration is also supposed to like show the way that slaves are treated and the way that they live and how they can always just walk off the farm, but if they do, they could get like punished, they could get whipped, like beaten to death, and it just shows the frustration of everybody who's pro-slavery in the South.
And like to build on to that, like I think it also satirizes how people kind of use other people for their own entertainment. Because I mean, Tom Sawyer is really doing this to have fun. I think like in the beginning of like this entire heist, when Huckleberry Finn says, "You need to help me help Jim," and he's like, "Yeah, this is going to be an adventure," and he specifically says it's going to be an adventure and that this is just for kicks. So I think Twain is kind of criticizing the way that people do just use people in the way that they would just use toys maybe to have a good time, especially with the immaturity maybe of Tom Sawyer.
I was kind of looking at the book, what would happen if you like took Tom Sawyer kind of out of the picture, and like, because for a large majority of the book he's not really in it, like he leaves on page 228, or not 220, he leaves on page 28 and doesn't come back, like his whole body, not just his thoughts like that Huck has, on page 215. So that's like a vast majority of the book he's gone, and I feel like he almost influences Huck in a way that like is close to his personality, but I feel like if he wasn't in the book, like I feel like the story could still go on. Yeah, it wouldn't be as great, especially satire wise with a lot of the things that Twain tries to prove, but I feel like if Tom Sawyer wasn't in it, the story could still go on.
Okay, if you guys are okay with this, I'm just gonna stop this recording and start recording again since it's like been 20 minutes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, we're good.
Okay, so after that pause, I think I'd like to propose another question, and that is, why do you think that Twain decides to make Jim speak in this hard-to-read type of dialogue? And why do you think he showed that on the book?
I think right away he wanted us to know that Jim was different than Huck, because we know that, well, at least in the beginning, Huck didn't have an education, so we kind of saw like all those apostrophes, all those like kind of mixed up words, and then until Huck got like an education and like he went to school, like it was so hard and frustrating. I remember to read like the first 10 pages because it was so much just like language that you had to like sit there and like go back and read. And so I feel like he wanted to like even show that more with Jim, because he had no education, he had like, he had nothing because he was a slave. So I think that Twain just wanted to show that vast difference between their education levels.
Yeah, I actually thought about the when I was going through that as well, and I was looking at the different dialects. I thought about the explanatory in the beginning of the book where it says, because he talks about the different dialects he's planning on using throughout the book. And he said, I made this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. So I kept going back to that because he made a specific point of mentioning the dialects. So I thought of the dialects bringing to the forefront the differences between the groups of people that he's talking about. I also found it a little ironic that they had a bunch of impersonations, one very much based in impersonating a British accent, especially given you'd suppose they were trying to talk alike, which in some cases they actually were. So I think I don't think it was by accident. I thought it was to make a point for Twain.
I agree with what you guys said on like how it kind of reflects on a symbolic level. I think I took it for granted that this was just supposed to be more realistic. I think it's like even on the back, it keeps saying that Huckleberry Finn was one of the novels to speak in a truly American voice, and I think that means just speaking how lots of people spoke then. So obviously, the more educated spoke in almost more flowery language, kind of like lots of clauses, and sometimes can be hard to read as well. But I think it was just to show that even though this is a satire and some of this gets kind of crazy, this is all based and like founded in real life, so we can definitely it's always relevant in that way.
I also think that the reason he let Huck always talk in kind of like a not perfect English is to remind us that this is from a boy's perspective. Like a lot of the things that he's saying, like especially the speech by the man after he shot the drunk guy. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how he gave like a speech and he was like, men are all cowards and stuff like that. Like, this is just a boy reporting this, supposedly writing this book, and there's so many deeper themes. So by writing in kind of imperfect English, it reminds the reader that all of the satire and irony is, Huck is oblivious to it. Like on page 45, this is just like one example of bad English, kind of pointing out the irony. It says, I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. It's talking about Jim's superstitions. It says, Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. And so, obviously, Jim does not know everything, and readers know that. But coming from Huck, with his imperfect English and his kind of messed up language, we might forget that, I guess, if it was written in perfect English, that Twain is trying to satirize the people's view of African Americans.
I also feel that he included the entire escapade with the spoon sort of to also remind the reader that this entire story you just read is from a boy's perspective, and to show that, like, although Huck didn't really notice any, like, irony or anything wrong with the people, that there truly was everything, and that you needed to look at it from a broader point of view.
And maybe if it's from a boy's perspective, if this is all from Huckleberry Finn, who is obviously a lot younger than we would imagine him to be a narrator of this huge book. Well, not huge book, but this book. Maybe it also suggests that you really do need a younger, maybe more innocent, and maybe at first more unsuspecting mind to be able to detect these things that are in some ways wrong with society, and that he is targeting and satirizing sometimes subtly, sometimes not too subtly.
Actually, I did notice that, like when Huck would talk about religion, he would talk about it in very blunt ways that most adults wouldn't talk about it, if for no other reason than the judgment of other adults. And kids don't have that as much.
Yeah, I feel that, like, if this story was told from a older point of view and not, like, from a child's point of view, he wouldn't be able to satirize religion as much as he wanted to and, like, as much as he could. And I don't remember what page this is on, but there was that in that section where there was the family feud, the people were going to church, but they were bringing guns with them. And the entire satire of this is, like, showing how hypocritical Christianity is. But being from an older point of view, they wouldn't be able to show all of the satire that Twain was trying to show.
So, I guess, like, another question that I could ask is, do you think that this novel really succeeded in convincing people at the time of, like, his message?
I was actually just thinking about this. Like, one of the questions I prepared was, like, if you didn't read this in our satire unit, would you have known it was satire? And I feel like I definitely would have, because there are some of the satire pieces we're reading where it's kind of like, oh, I might have just taken this literally if I hadn't have known. But this, like, sometimes the satire is so blunt, especially when Huck is talking about Jim, and like we said earlier, like saying he's smart because he's white inside and stuff like that. So I definitely think that it was effective. I mean, obviously this by itself did not end slavery, but I think it was probably one of the factors that led to changing the American people's beliefs.
In A-Push, we were actually talking about this book, and one of the things Miss Thompson was saying was that, like, this book was banned in the North and the South. In the South because it wasn't racist enough, and in the North because it was too racist. So it was, like, it was kind of interesting, like, especially back then, because, like, you would, like, reading it now, we can tell, especially with some of the language he uses, like, it's, like, we would never, ever say some of that stuff today. But, like, thinking that that was almost okay and normal back then is just weird to think about.
And I think it's funny that you said, like, it is too racist in some areas and, like, not racist enough in others. And that's so, I think that is actually really true. And I don't know, I would have never thought of that, but that is, yeah. And I think another thing is with, like, those little tidbits of where Huckleberry is thinking about Jim, and in a way that kind of just, like, he's just thinking honestly about Jim, and, like, we already talked about how, like, he must be white inside. I think sometimes that's so subtle that maybe if you didn't already have, like, the subconscious idea that, hey, maybe this is a little bit wrong, or like, that this, you know, there's something not right here, that maybe you could have just glanced over it. And I feel like in a different time period, in a different atmosphere, that might have definitely worked, and it might not have been as effective.
Yeah, so looking at when it was first published, I'm pretty sure it was published after slavery was officially ended. No, there was racial problems long after that. And I think it was set in, like, the content was set in the 20s or 30s, 1820s or 30s. And I thought it was interesting that he wrote that piece and published it after the fact, because you'd think this would be convincing to make it stop. Because I think a lot of people saw it as a victory who were anti-slavery saw it as a victory when it was just straight up abolished. But the fact that he would feel the need to publish this even after, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, in the front it just says that it was published in 1884, so that was after the Civil War. But there was still obviously a lot of racial discrimination long until the 19th century, or the 20th century. So
I feel like the point of the book wasn't really to satirize slavery per se, but more to satirize the way that we treat African Americans during that time period. And to show, like, you treat them so poorly, they're, like, worse, they're treated worse than dirt.
So yeah, in that way, it would be more relevant for that time period. I think that is an interesting way to look at it, because it's true. I think the book has a lot of stuff in it, and there's definitely more than just satirizing slavery in the context of the book, or African Americans present day, or his present day, but also how people treat other people. I noticed at some parts there was like definitely satirizing how people act as a mob, a really fickle, just horrible, like masses. Like in Gov last year, my teacher kept saying that like the people can be just fickle lemmings, and we're just going to lead each other off the cliff, and we're going to fall into like the depths below. And he's definitely satirizing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, actually, this reminds me of a quote from another book, and it said, this isn't about what someone can do to another person and get away with. It's about what someone can do to another person and be forgiven for. And I noticed that a lot when I was thinking of how Huck felt about his relationships, because, and even back to the I knew he was white inside, like the people who kept trying to manipulate him and steal from him and con him out of his money were white. They were his father, they were the Duke, they were the king. And the person who actually stuck by him was Jim. But he kept forgiving them, the people who did wrong by him, because that was just how the thing that you did then.
Yeah, I noticed that Twain was pointing out exactly what you were saying, and people who were white were much more easily forgiven, going to your quote, than the people who were African American. And on page 79, Huck and Jim are talking, and they're talking about like what they would accept from a black versus a white man, and it says, I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head. That is, if he wasn't white. I wouldn't allow no black man to call me that. So, I mean, he's clearly having different standards just based on the different races. So I think Twain is trying to point that out to readers. Like, they're both humans, and throughout the whole novel, like, they were showing how Jim was a better companion to Huck than were the King and the Duke, and like, just because his skin is a different color does not make him more or less accountable or forgivable.
When we were reading I'm pretty sure it's called Advice to the Youth, that Twain, the poem he wrote, or the speech that he said, I thought so much of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn when I was reading it, just because like his appeal in both books to like society's flaws, and like they're perfect perspectives that like you have to be this way, you have to do this to fit in, and this is how people acted. I just feel like all of his writings, or at least the two that I read, like intertwine so much with the messages that he wants to get people to know.
Yeah, and I definitely agree, like, how there's, like, a good connection between that essay and Huckleberry Finn. I noticed that, like, in both of those writing pieces, he definitely mentioned, like, lying and manipulation as, like, a common theme in society, and that's definitely something that he, like, touched on in Huckleberry Finn, because Huck kind of, like, lied his way, like, through, like, towns and, like, throughout his journey. He really, like, relied on lying, and other people lied to him and, like, tried to manipulate him. So I think that's definitely, like, a flaw in society that Twain was trying to, like, kind of, like, discuss and, like, make people aware of. Because I forget, like, what page number it was, but there was a point when Huck said something along the lines of, like, oh, like, telling the truth is, like, risky, and it's so unnatural, and it's so, like, unregular, because like lying was just, it came so easy to him, and it's just something that he was so used to that like telling the truth and like being honest was just so like foreign.
And going to the whole thing about lie and truth, I think this goes back to, like we already mentioned, but on page 214, that's kind of associated with what Huckleberry just decides then and there, that he just thinks that I'm committing such a huge sin right now. I'm just gonna commit the rest of my life to wickedness. And he says, in the third paragraph, like, all right, then I'll go to hell, and tore up the paper that was gonna reveal, supposedly that, Jim was here, or he was just gonna sell him out in some way. So I think the whole thing, especially maybe too, about the concept in that context of what is right and what is wrong and what constitute lies, sometimes is a little bit messed up in its own way, and it's a little bit backwards too.
I feel like a lot of people, like, especially with Huckleberry, they didn't, like, point out that he was, like, a bad liar or that he was doing something wrong, which is why he still lies so much, especially so far into the book. And on page 119, when the real cousins come back and he basically tells Huck that he's, like, a bad liar and that he's awkward and, like, doesn't know how to lie, I feel like that's one of the first times, like, in the whole book that Huck realizes that what he's doing is almost, like, he can't get away with every single thing that he does.
Yeah, and I feel like he learns that he can't get away with everything that he does throughout the book. Because, like, in the beginning of the book, he pretended to be a girl, and he didn't get away with it. She caught him out. She was saying, oh, you're not a girl, you're doing all of these things wrong to be a girl, and he doesn't learn anything from that. But later on, like, as the story progresses and as he sees more people getting punished for what they did, like the tar and feathering of the Duke and the King, and getting caught with this entire spoon fiasco, that, like, he learns that he can't get away with everything else, even though he should have learned the lesson earlier on.
So what do you guys think is significant about Jim, like, I guess concealing the fact that, like, the dead man that he and Huck found at the beginning of the story was Huck's father, and then not telling him until, like, much later that, like, that was his father that they found?
That ironically, like, is a lie. Like, I don't know, maybe it's not outright lying, but it is concealing the truth. So maybe, because we were having the discussion in our class with advice to youth, like, is he saying that you do need a lie in your life? He's, like, telling you that you're going to encounter lying no matter what? Or is he saying that, the truth is powerful and you really shouldn't cover it up? And I think in some ways maybe Twain is admitting that lying can be good, and it maybe because it comes from Jim and he's just trying to protect Huck, because you can imagine how that would be, and he's probably thinking that there's this young boy, and if he sees that image, maybe he doesn't connect it with his father being abusive and gone until he arrives in the beginning of the book. But that was a lie, and so maybe lies aren't all bad or all as black and white as they seem. So I have a question for you guys. We already mentioned the symbolism or the symbol of the river, and I also saw the reoccurring motif of, I don't know, kind of death running throughout the novel, because he always mentions dead people. I think in the river, he keeps saying that there's this area where dead people gather, and obviously his father shows up dead on the boat at the end, or is mentioned again. And sometimes just in his language, he says, we slept like dead people, and he just compares it to death. So do you guys think there's a reason for that? Does that tie into the superstition of the whole novel?
I think that's, like, an interesting point, and death is definitely, like, a reoccurring theme throughout the novel, and I feel like Twain is definitely, like, satirizing that in many ways. Like, on page 180, Twain kind of, like, satirizes funeral services, because like in the passage, like kind of through the use of like dark humor, he describes like the sickly instrument that's being played, the interruption of the dog and the rat, and the popularity of the Undertaker. And he says that Peter was the only one that had a good thing. So he's kind of saying like the subject of death often involves a lot of like fuss and ceremony, but like what good does it do? So he's definitely like, I guess, discussing death a lot and like how society views it and how like it's significant in, I guess, like these characters' lives and just like in society.
I also feel like he satirizes people's reactions to death. Like he had the entire woman who were fake crying because they wanted to show off, and like on page 221 he's talking about death, and in there he's satirizing how if you don't know a person on a very personal level, you won't really care what happens to them, because he talks about death and it is a super casual tone. He says they had to amputate him, but it didn't save him. So it's like so casual, and it's just satirizing the way that people talk about others when they don't know them on a personal level.
Yeah, I know, like, what you were saying at the beginning, especially about how people react to death. I think he might be making fun of how people, I don't know, get all sad after people die, and, like, how they, I don't know, do you guys remember when we read that poem last year, I think? It was about, like, give me my flowers before I die. It was basically, like, say nice things to me while I'm alive, don't say them after I'm dead. Because even if you didn't know this dead person, of course, or even if you didn't like them, sometimes you're like, oh, you know, they were such a great person after they're dead, but you might have been saying really mean things to them while they were alive. And especially through the Duke and the King and how they were making up these fake gushy speeches for the death of this man who they didn't even know. They could still make up a perfect speech about him because speeches at funerals are so generic, and I think Twain might be making fun of that, because on page 167, this is just a piece of the speech he was giving. It says, friends all, my poor brother that lays yonder has done generous by them that's left behind in the vale of sorrows, and all that stuff. Like, I don't know. I feel like he's kind of making fun of funerals and how, like Amelia was saying, people react to death.
Well, I think it was two-pronged. I think he was making fun of that, and I think he was comparing that, because someone else brought up, I don't remember who, page 221, and on it, it says, there was an accident, and it says, goodness gracious, anybody hurt? And they say no first, and then they say it killed someone who was black. And so I think it was pointing out like the hypocrisy and, oh no, they're dead, let's all have that whole ceremony around, even if, like you said, even if we don't like them, we're going to get all worked up about it unless they're black, in which case we won't even consider it as if someone was hurt.
And also going with that kind of reaction, like no reaction at all, even though it's not in the context of like different races. In the beginning of the book, when Tom Sawyer gets together his secret gang, who are going to be fancy highway robbers and thieves, they figure that everybody's going to have to kill someone in order to get in or stay in, and they just they have to stop when they come to Huckleberry Finn, and because they say, he has got a father, but he's drunk, you can find him, and that doesn't work. And it says on page 8 that they talked it over, and they was going to rule me out, because they said every boy must have a family or somebody to kill, or else it wouldn't be fair and square for the others. Well, nobody could think of anything to do. Everybody was stumped and sat still. So I think even though they're obviously young boys talking about this, they talk about death very casually, and about the death of a loved one, or just someone in their family who you would assume is a loved one, really casually. And maybe that's even on a subconscious level satirizing how people view death as that, because young boys are associated with immaturity, and some of us maybe are just, being, we're talking about death so blatantly, and that's, it's just reflecting on that shallower level.
Actually, that made me think of, I think he was satirizing specifically in terms of people's reactions to death, comparing how they actually feel about it, which is almost disturbingly casual, like you were just talking about when they were just sitting alone with their friends. But when they're in public about death, that's when they are very extravagant with their reaction. So I think it's partially making other people think that you care.
I feel like this entire being a different person than you actually are, like this entire, oh, I'm so sad that this person died, and crying, while at home you're very casual about it and you don't really care. I feel that is exemplified by the Duke and the King, how they always have these fake personalities, but it's never truly them, and it just shows the fake personalities of people throughout society as a whole.
Okay, if you guys... sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask you guys another question? So what do you guys think was the point in including the little, short story about the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons? That seemed so random, and they all died off so quickly. I was like, why even create these characters if you're just gonna kill them off? So, why do you think Twain included that?
If you guys are okay with that, so we're all digesting that question, I'm gonna pause this and restart it again. So,
okay, go ahead.
My timer says 46 minutes, so we could probably wrap it up after this question too.
Okay, I'm recording again.
I guess in response to Caroline's question about the feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, I think Twain was kind of satirizing arguments and just, I guess, family feuds in real life. And how the feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons was so ridiculous because like Caroline said, they were just killing each other off so quickly, and it seemed so ridiculous it was kind of unrealistic. So I think he was definitely using exaggeration there to kind of say well, yeah, a lot of family feuds are ridiculous. In real life, so many people argue to huge extents, and there's really no point to it.
When I read that part, I almost thought he was satirizing almost a civil war, because there's two completely different views of one of not specifically slavery, why it started, but eventually slavery was part of the solution. And you have the North and the South, brothers fighting each other, and after a while it just seems ridiculous that this nation is splitting apart because you can't get along, and there can't be any means of resolution in anywhere in between. So I feel he was almost satirizing the fact that we as a nation win a war against each other, even though we're one nation.
I feel that another thing that he is satirizing through this entire feud is Shakespeare, because the way that it turned out being a reverse Romeo and Juliet, where two people from opposing family feuds fall in love while their families are fighting, and in the end, the Romeo and Juliet die. But in this story, the family members die, and the Romeo and Juliet stay the same people, stay still alive. And I feel that this entirety is satirizing Shakespeare, and this goes on to happen again further in the book when he satirizes Shakespeare with that entire speech we talked about.
All right, so I guess do you guys just want to wrap it up then?
Yeah, let's do concluding thoughts, because I'm at 49 minutes, so.
Okay.
Good book, guys.
I actually really enjoyed it. I started out the book hating it, from the grammar, and I was just oh my god, this is impossible to read. And by the end, I was just this is such a good book. It shows so much satire. It was so funny. it was absolutely ridiculous in some parts, and it really shows what humanity is like.
Yeah, the further into the book I got, and the more things I picked out, the more I felt like I was just always missing something. Like, my dad actually suggested that I read Huck Finn, and he doesn't ever reread books, but he said he's reread this 4 times and found something new every time. And so I feel like there's just a lot of levels that we don't see yet. And like the more I saw, the more that I had that feeling.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like throughout when I was reading the beginning of the book, I was kind of freaking out because I was like, I'm probably not getting everything I'm supposed to get. And I was like, as soon as I'm done with the book, I'm getting the movie and I'm watching it and I'm like soaking up all these deep messages. But yeah, I totally agree. Like as it goes on, you start to see more of the themes because they keep reappearing, and you start to get this feeling that yeah, this is really complex, but also really good and really engaging.
It's also like a good book for children, and it's like even children can get the message while it's super deep. My mom had actually read the book when she was 8 for the first time, and she's just like, oh yeah, I actually saw some of the flaws that he was pointing out. And I think that he did a really, if like an 8-year-old can see all of these flaws, that means that he's doing like a really good job of pointing it out, but he also does a great job of always having something deeper to it.
Yeah, like about the deeper meaning, honestly, like sometimes when I read a book, I'm like, oh, like writing books must be so easy. Like you just come up with a plot line and then write it. But this book, like this must have taken him forever to write. Like I could reread a paragraph and find something new or 2 things new. Like he must have really thought this through.
And it's like, it's even harder because he was doing this crazy grammar throughout the book. So it's like writing with a deep meaning while also keeping up with this crazy grammar throughout the book and this crazy dialogue. I thought that was like amazing that he was able to do that.
I felt like every little thing that he added within the book had some sort of significant purpose. Like even like what we were talking about, the family feud, like you look at that and it's like, that's so weird they were in there for like not even 10 pages. But then you look back and it's like, whoa, that's like representing so many different things and like can be like looked at so many different perspectives and stuff. So I just think it's so cool how he like layers each one of his points when he writes. All right, are we done then?
Yeah.